Welcome to Executive Session from Directors and Boards.
The reality is that boards have a limited number of seats, usually somewhere between 7 and 15 members. And you don't want somebody who has depth in one area but really can't contribute meaningfully in the others.
Hello and welcome to Executive Session, the official podcast of Directors and Boards. I'm your host, Bill Hayes, Editor-in-Chief of Directors and Boards. We just heard from Jeff Sakaguchi, Director of Eccentex Corporation and former Chair of TrueBlue Inc. on CHROs on boards. In this episode of Executive Session, we'll also explore the move from operator to director with Rebecca Martinez O'Mara and director conflicts of interest with Kris Pederson. Board independence is one of the foundations of good governance, but maintaining that independence is often more complicated than it appears. Relationships, investments, overlapping business interests, and even the perception of divided loyalties can create governance challenges long before they become headline issues. In this segment with Kris Pederson, Director and NomGov Chair of SOBRsafe and Director of Eagle Bank, we'll explore how boards can protect trust, preserve credibility, and navigate one of the most important and often misunderstood aspects of effective governance, conflicts of interest. Kris, when directors hear the phrase conflict of interest, they often think of blatant ethical violations, but in today's boardroom, what are the more subtle or common conflicts boards actually encounter?
Well, when you think of boards and their fiduciary duties, especially the duty of loyalty, which is where conflicts of interest sit, they're really governed by three things. One, they need to act with candor, honesty, integrity, always in the institution's best interest. They can't have self-dealing or advancement of their own interests, and they can't benefit personally or their family benefit from information they hear, confidential information they hear in the boardroom or in the management meetings. So conflicts can be, direct violations of those, Bill, but the subtle ones are interesting. Public boards have requirements for committee structure where only independent directors, for example, under Sarbanes-Oxley, sit on audit committees. The listings for NASDAQ and the New York Stock Exchange require the NomGov committee to have independent directors, and only independent directors can actually vote on new directors. Dodd-Frank has restrictions on the comp committee, can only be independent directors. So I've seen some board members that weren't independent sitting on some of those committees and taking votes when really they shouldn't be. So that's an example of a subtle challenge. Other things are, for example, when a director interlocks board seats, and that means they sit on a board of one company that has some relationship to the other company. For example, two companies in the same industry, they're on the same board, or a conflict in terms of the board seat overlapping with a competitor or a customer, a major vendor, a supplier to the company. So that board seat interlock can sometimes not be significantly vetted. Subtle engagement around director relationships. So, under the fiducia of loyalty rules per se, directors have to be very sensitive to their relationships with anybody on the management team, but it's also key shareholders, key vendors, and that includes, in my old world, the professional services, the advisors, the auditors, the consultants. Those things need to be free of conflict, and you see some subtlety there in terms of breaches. And then finally, and I don't know if it's subtle or not, but a third area where I've seen some direct conflict is in the receipt of funds from the company, where other than just director fees, which of course are allowed, a director is not allowed to take any other compensation. And I've had two cases in my board career where I've seen finder's fees, commissions being paid to a director when they brought in business. Sometimes in the not-for-profit world, had a company, and then we were going through some board training and went through this fiduciary duty, and there was sort of a wake-up call around the boardroom, and two directors actually had some conflicts. One was able to resolve, and one actually resigned from the board. So that can be a sticky wicket as well.
As a NomGov chair, how do you identify potential conflicts before someone joins the board, especially the less obvious ones that may not appear in a standard disclosure process?
Well, the standard disclosure process is typically done via a board questionnaire focusing on conflicts, and that asks things around, do you or immediate family members have any direct dealings with the company, compensation arrangements, any personal affiliations with the company or company that's doing business with the company. So that's one that gets vetted. Similarly, around competitors, do you engage with competitors or have relationships or contracts coming with competitors? And then there's sort of a broad disclosure around, disclose any other interests, activities, involvement that could make you impartial. And this whole notion of conflicts is that the director needs to stay impartial. So that can be one, that the candidate might have some interesting information there. A lot of times these documents are very dense, and I've seen sometimes that they're not vetted very well, but there's often a lot of information in those questionnaires. But outside, that would maybe be more of the normal process. But I think it's really important in terms of reference checks and scrutiny of the director, looking at their roles, industries, other board seats, and those need to be vetted strongly. A lot of times board seats and board directors aren't vetted very strongly. I think people and companies assume, well, by the time you're a director, you've already been vetted. But the director's roles can change. And again, as they're building their portfolio life and portfolio career, that can include a lot of new roles coming in and out, especially board seats. So I think that's important. And also, having direct discussions with the candidates' board chairs or other committee members, committee chairs where they served, to get a feel for the director, how they engage, if they saw any conflicts at their board. Those can be vetted directly as well.
Not every conflict means a director should leave the board. How should boards determine whether a conflict can be managed versus when it becomes disqualifying?
I think the first is to look at the act to see if it's episodic, it's a kind of one-time thing, or if it's structural, it's something that will continue on. Episodic examples would be a hiring decision. The board knows someone senior is interviewing for a CFO role. The board is part of the interview process. That director should probably not engage in that process. Or vendor selection, where there's a family member or a good friend who's part of that company that's bidding. Those can be managed around. The director can excuse himself, recuse, or sit out. So the director relationship can be managed around. The bigger challenge are those structural conflicts. And as a partner at EY, there's specific director conflicts around the auditor, for example. If a new auditor is assigned and there's a partner on the board that was part of that company, even though they're retired and still draws a pension from that firm, they cannot sit on the board if the auditor is their old firm. So there's rules like that where it's structural. The auditor would have to resign from the board. So the structural ones are more challenging. but there's a lot of gray areas in some of those elements, even structural ones. So then it's a question, can you manage it? Or to your point, is it disqualifying? And then it's all around, financial materiality. How big is this thing? The duration and frequency, one or two things are ongoing. Is there an impact on the duty of loyalty, right? Can that director still maintain unbiased, purely focused on the good of the company? And the other more subtle that really has to be considered is that reputational risk. If this gets out that we're paying you a commission and you're on the board, even if we could work through legally, would that pass the sniff test of our reputation if that were leaked? What would our members, our customers think about that? So I think those are elements that need to be considered on do you manage it, manage around it, or is it disqualifying? The director needs to resign.
That was Kris Pederson. Next up, we'll speak with Jeff Sakaguchi. As board responsibilities continue to expand, one question has become increasingly difficult to answer. What expertise truly belongs in the boardroom? While human capital has become a strategic priority for nearly every public company, boards remain divided over whether that requires a CHRO as a director or a different approach to governance. In this segment with Jeff Sakaguchi, director of Eccentex Corporation and former chair of TrueBlue Inc, we'll examine how boards can ensure they're providing meaningful oversight of talent, leadership, and organizational health. Jeff, human capital has become a board-level issue, yet very few public company boards appoint CHROs as directors. Why do you think boards remain reluctant to add CHROs? And are they missing an important perspective or making a disciplined governance choice?
Well, thanks, Bill. It's an interesting question. There is a lot going on. First off, let me just say that I think CHROs have some of the most important responsibilities in any successful company. We often talk about how every company is now a technology company, given the rise of internet-based communication and commerce and intelligence. But I'd add that every company is also a people company, and the role of humans in these organizations is getting more and more complex. So CHROs and effective human capital management are really central to one of the highest priorities for boards to oversee. But that being said, most CHROs are focused on the people, the culture, and the processes that go into building a high-performance organization. They've traditionally not been brought up through business operations, or they haven't had deep grounding in the financials or been responsible for corporate strategy. So most boards see them like those on the legal teams, accounting teams, and other support functions as domain specialists, but not having the broader exposure to the other elements of a board's oversight and fiduciary responsibility. They fall a bit short against most of those kind of skill matrix-driven comparisons.
In the piece on CHROs that you contributed to for directors and boards, you argued that boards should be composed primarily of broad-based generalists rather than functional specialists. As board agendas become increasingly complex, from AI and cybersecurity to workforce strategy and culture, how should directors decide when they need expertise in the boardroom versus expertise available to the boardroom?
Well, let me clarify that first comment a bit. When I say generalist, what I mean is someone with experience across the major drivers of performance. So that's business operations, strategy, financial performance, leadership, and growing shareholder value. You've probably heard the term T-shaped skill sets before. I think the best board members are really those who have several legs of the T. I don't know what I'd call that, but the more legs of a T a person has, the more he or she can contribute to that growing array of issues boards must address. The reality is that boards have a limited number of seats, usually somewhere between 7 and 15 members. And you don't want somebody who has depth in one area but really can't contribute meaningfully in the others. For instance, there was a push a few years ago to bring CIOs onto boards because there was a sense that boards lacked technology literacy. Then there was the CISOs, the chief security officers, when cyber risk was growing and had the potential to have material impact on the financials. And then even for a short while, it was ESG experts, right? Climate and all of that. And time after time, boards realize that these types of specialists are better as advisors and committee members. And I think the same generally holds true of CHROs. And I'd say, like the CIOs and CISOs and legal and policy experts and chief accounting officers, CHROs play an extremely important part in many of the board's key responsibilities, such as executive compensation, incentive programs, culture-based initiatives, leadership development and succession, and even more. The point is, CHROs should play a part in every board meeting and should be a point person on a compensation committee or an HCM committee.
If a board chooses not to recruit a CHRO director, what are the most effective ways directors can gain confidence that they truly understand the health of the workforce, succession pipeline, and organizational culture, rather than relying on management's interpretation of those issues?
Well, I think the superpower of most good board members is they know how to ask the right questions, and they know how to ask the right questions of the right people. And I think most board members usually have had direct experience in leading people, having a strong understanding of how culture affects performance and the ins and outs of executive compensation. But in addition to the corporate CHRO, there are usually standing third parties, a compensation consultant, which usually also brings leading perspectives on human capital management, and others who they're either parts of engagement surveys or outside advisors, others who will perform some type of study that supports organizational cultural initiatives. So the best companies usually rely on these kinds of tools and surveys to get independent evaluations of what's going on in the workforce. And then there's the management by walking around approach, where board members can spend time in the field, meet employees directly, face to face, get a sense of what they're going through and what they're thinking. And for good boards, it's virtually impossible for management to hide poor organizational performance and health. And the key is to find a great CHRO who can build and sustain a high-performing organization.
That was Jeff Sakaguchi. Next up, we'll speak with Rebecca Martinez O'Mara. The responsibilities of public company directors have never been broader, yet many accomplished executives discover that board service requires a fundamentally different way of thinking. Success in the boardroom depends not on managing the business, but on asking better questions, exercising sound judgment, and seeing risks and opportunities through a wider governance lens. In this segment with Rebecca Martinez O'Mara, Director and Chair of the NomGov Committee of Kadant and Director of Enviri, we'll discover what separates effective directors from first-time board members who are still making the transition from operator to overseer. Rebecca, many executives assume that being a successful operator naturally translates into being an effective director. What are the biggest mindset shifts leaders underestimate when they move from running a business to overseeing one from the boardroom?
I would say the biggest mind shift for me was going from an operator trying to run a company to becoming more of a steward of the business. And that takes a whole different sort of approach. As an operator, if you've run a factory or a billion-dollar company, you spent decades of your career trying to fix things, hands-on, sleeves rolled up, trying to make improvements, drive growth, drive revenue, whatever it is. And as a director, it's just a much more patient game. And what I mean by that is what I've learned to do is recognize that I'm trying to shift the air. And what I mean by that is there's situations, perhaps I've asked for some information to better understand a strategy. And it may not in that meeting produce itself, but then I'll notice another director will follow up with that. So I've shifted the air in terms of how the business is run, and I've done it in a way that considers the long term, the shareholders, and so forth.
You mentioned that many first-time directors underestimate the amount of preparation and context building required. Beyond simply reading the board book, what are the habits and learning disciplines that separate directors who become truly valuable from those who remain passive participants?
So that's a really good question, and I think it took me a while to figure it out. So again, as an operator, as somebody coming from the executive group, right, I was trying to study the deck harder, which makes no sense at all. You cannot study the deck harder. And so what I started to realize is when you're coming in new to a board, a lot of the content is you've never seen it before. You don't know the formats. And so it's foreign, and you can't expect yourself to understand every detail in perhaps a new industry, different acronyms, and so on. So what I've learned to do is I sort of just even beyond receiving a deck, when I'm in my off moments, I'm studying, I'm researching, right? So for example, I went really deep on executive compensation a few weeks ago, where I spent a few hours thinking about how compensation works. Not what RSUs are, not what base pay or bonus pay is, not what PSUs are. Not I understand those things, right? As a former executive. I mean, what are the second and third order effects when you create an incentive structure that's 60% equity, for example? So that's the kind of studying. Another example is I went really deep on what sovereign wealth funds were. Why do those things matter to my boards? It makes me a better rounded board member.
Committee work, compensation structures, equity awards, and fiduciary obligations can all be more complex than executives expect when they first join a public company board. What are some of the hidden realities of board service that newer directors are often unprepared for?
So committees and committee work, they're vastly different depending on the board that you're on. If you're in the middle of a transaction, for example, a sizable transaction, and you're on the audit committee, believe me, you're going to do more than your 4 audit committee meetings a year to prepare for, your filings. So yeah, it's vast. It varies greatly depending on, you could be on another board that's a steady growth, consistent performer. But personally, I had a lot to learn. I had worked for a company for 40 years. I got a paycheck. I got bonuses sometimes. I got equity packages. Sometimes, in the old days, we used to get options, and then it became RSUs. But what I didn't ever have to worry about were things like taxes and liquidity and cash flow and required holding for your equity position. And then what that means in your overall balanced portfolio, right? And I'm talking about your personal finances. So that was a big shift for me. And what I did was I rolled up my sleeves And I built spreadsheets and figured out taxes on my own because I felt it was really important for me to understand, the mechanics. And then once I did, then I sort of outsourced it to what I call my A team, right? And so they could do it more efficiently. So that's having a great tax person, having a great financial manager, having a great lawyer. And so that was, again, a huge difference from working for getting a paycheck for 40 years, put it that way.
Okay, everybody. Well, thank you so much to Rebecca Martinez O'Mara, Jeff Sakaguchi, and Kris Pederson. And thank you for joining us for this episode of Executive Session. Please look out for our next episode. And if you enjoyed this episode, make sure to share it with your friends and colleagues and let them know they can look for it on the Directors and Boards website. Also, make sure to check out directorsandboards.com, where you can get all the articles from our magazine, as well as so much more. You might also be interested in our weekly newsletter, which you can subscribe to at our website. And when you visit the site, make sure to check out all our back episodes of Executive Session, which are also available wherever you get podcasts. And for the videocast version of the show, as well as individual interview segments, you can check out the Directors and Boards YouTube channel. One last thing, the agenda for the Character of the Corporation 2026, being held November 12th in New York City, is available at the Directors and Boards website. Check it out today and get more details about the event. So once again, I'm your host, Bill Hayes, and until next time, consider this executive session closed.